on Zoom. Next month's presentation will be by Peter Tanazzo on the Sault Ste. Marie City's Action Transportation Plan. Okay. So just prior to beginning, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We would like to begin by acknowledging that we are in the Robinson Huron and Robinson Superior Treaty Territory, and that the land on which we are gathered is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, specifically the Garden River and Batchewana First Nations, as well as the settlement lands of the Métis people. So I'd invite Emma to start her presentation now.
Awesome, thank you, Rob. Yep, I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay, so yes, hello. My name is Emma Meadows, as Rob said, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. Before we get into the main presentation, I wanted to go over the Northern Ontario Youth Climate Action Summits that were held earlier this week, yesterday and today in Sault Ste. Marie. So the Northern Ontario Youth Climate Action Summits are a two-day interactive conference for local high school students to learn, be inspired, and take action on climate change. The summit combines presentations, workshop sessions, and community action activities that are hosted by local organizations in the community. The goal of these summits is to engage and empower youth in current climate science and Indigenous traditional knowledge so that they have the tools to address some of the impacts of climate change in their community. The summit helps the students build their capacity towards climate change resiliency to take individual action in their everyday lives and strengthen their community connections to address climate change in their schools and community. The summit is part of a global network of 30+ climate action summits that have taken place all over the world. So we know that climate change is a serious topic, so these summits offer the students the creative freedom to define their own role in addressing climate change. The culminating activity of the summit, which the students did this afternoon, is when students create their own climate action plans at the end of day 2 and then present them to the rest of us. The climate action planning activity is where the students lay out their plan for how they're going to take action to address climate change in their community. These action plans could include things like waste reduction or starting a composting program or planting a pollinator garden at their school. So we host these summits in 5 communities across Northern Ontario, and they are part of our week-long science festivals that we host in each community. So I'm currently in Sault Ste. Marie. I'm based in Sudbury, but this week is the Sault Ste. Marie Science Festival hosted by Science North. And we've already hosted a summit in North Bay, Thunder Bay, Kenora, and now Sault Ste. Marie. The Sudbury Summit is at the end of May. And then next year, we're going to come back to all these communities and host the summits again. So the goal is to come back to a lot of the same students that we engaged with in the previous year and learn about the climate action plans that they worked on over the year. We hope we can celebrate the projects that the students started or worked on, expand on them, maybe help finish them, and then hopefully start to create some new climate action plans with the students. So yesterday and today at the Sioux Climate Summit, we hosted our Sault Ste. Marie Climate Action Summit. And like I said, we're going to come back this time next year and host the summit again to see the progress that was made. So on day 1, which was yesterday at the Sioux Summit, we had workshops that included the climate change initiatives that are happening in the city of Sault Ste. Marie with the sustainability coordinator and how the students could get more involved in those initiatives in the city and even contribute some ideas. We had the different conservancy groups around the area kind of come together and join a host workshop on how local land trusts can work together to combat climate change. And Tomica hosted a workshop on climate change and invasive species. Paul from the Climate Hub, we had a lot of members from the Sioux Climate Hub there. So thank you to Paul, Rob, Ted, Mark, everyone that participated. Paul hosted on why soil matters and its promise as a climate solution. And then the Jane Goodall Institute of Canada held discussions with the students about community climate mapping, and really identifying the issues in the community that the students wanted to try to fix. So on day 2, which was today, we had our action activities. So one action activity was looking at the effects that climate change has on the maple syrup tapping season with Hogan's Homestead. They brought pieces of trees, cut off bark, taps, and tapping tools for the students to play around with and actually produce their own maple syrup. The second action activity was a litter cleanup along parts of the Hub Trail. This activity was put on with the help of members from the Climate Hub, so thank you again, and staff from the city as well. During this activity, we talked with the students about the importance of waste management, putting waste in its place, but also trying to reduce the amount of waste that we as humans generate in general, and how we need to take better care of our natural environment, how we cannot see the environment as our personal garbage can. And I think overall that the students really enjoyed this litter cleanup activity, and it changed the way that they see waste. I don't think any of them will be littering again, or at least they better not be. And then to wrap up the 2-day summit, this afternoon, the students worked on their climate action plans. So the students worked in groups and started to think about their school or community and the environmental problems that they are facing, what resources are available, and what topics they are passionate about. Then they started to brainstorm a project that they could implement at their school, a project that is tangible and realistic and relevant. The students came up with some really great ideas and projects that I really think they and their teachers are going to make happen over the next year, which is really exciting. Some of the project ideas were starting up a club at the school that did weekly cleanups around the community for volunteer hours. So again, I think the litter cleanup was quite inspiring for some of the students. Starting up a garden on the school grounds to grow produce for the bistro class, starting up a pollinator garden, maybe even having a greenhouse on the school grounds, and as well as starting up a climate change resources club to share resources and media with the rest of the school to spread awareness, educate, and then get more people at the school involved. So overall, the point of the summit is not to scare the students about the impacts and the seriousness of climate change, but to educate them on the realities of climate change and provide them with tools and solutions for how to address those problems, to show them that they can make a difference and that their actions, no matter how small, they matter and they add up. And my hope is that the students left the summit feeling more hopeful and more inspired than when they arrived. And like I said, we'll be back next year where we can hopefully engage with some of the same students and keep building their knowledge and their involvement. So these are some pictures from the 2 days that we had. We hosted it at the Bush Plain, which was a great venue, and we had local high school students come and participate in the workshops. So yeah, just some pictures from the past couple of days. Pictures from the workshop. There is Paul and his soil workshop, and Tomika looking at invasive species using microscopes. The students were really engaged with those. The different conservancy groups, Algoma Conservancy, Kensington Conservancy, the Lake Superior Watershed Group. And then these are pictures from the local the litter cleanup that we hosted today. So it was a beautiful day for it. We lucked out, and I think the students really enjoyed it. So now I am going to get into my other presentation on food for a sustainable future, environmental benefits of plant-based eating. And I want to start with a little bit about me. I know Rob gave an introduction, but I'm the staff scientist for climate action at Science North, and I'm also the vice chair of Science North's Green Team. If you haven't heard of Science North, it's a science center located in Sudbury, Ontario, and it's actually Canada's second largest science center. I've worked at Science North for over a year now, and before that, I worked with the provincial government at the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation, and Parks. In my role at Science North, I work to inspire audiences across Canada, particularly youth, to take action on climate change and incorporate sustainable practices into everyday life. Climate change is something that I think about all the time. I'm a climate scientist, but it's something that I also just kind of think about as a person. I think about climate change a lot. I thought about it growing up in school, and that led me to do a Master of Environmental Sciences where I specialized in climate change impacts and adaptation. And now, present day, I am a climate scientist. So again, I think about climate change every day. And even though it's a part of my job as a climate scientist, I think about it as a person too, and as a person living in this society and living in this world, as I'm sure all of you do too. Climate change is a part of life now. It's a part of everyone's life. So in my life as a person on this earth, I want to do the best that I can to prevent climate change. So in my life, I find myself often asking, what can I do? As I'm sure a lot of you do as well. And there are many things that I do in my life on a daily basis, or at least try to do in my life as often as possible to lower my environmental footprint. These are things like using reusable grocery bags, a reusable water bottle, trying to save energy and water where I can, biking or taking the bus to work, and many other actions. But I also wanted to know which actions that I was taking made the largest impact. I strongly believe that all actions add up, but I know that some actions can have a larger impact than others. So I wanted to know what those actions were. So a couple of years ago, I did some research and I found this comprehensive study that was done in 2017 that considered a broad range of individual lifestyle choices and then calculated the potential greenhouse gas emissions from those lifestyle choices in developed countries. This study analyzed 148 scenarios of the climate impacts of individual behaviors in 10 developed countries, and identified a dozen individual actions that had the greatest potential to lower an environmental footprint. Of those dozen actions, there were 4 actions that were labeled as high impact actions that would cause the largest reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in an individual's life. And these 4 high impact actions were having one fewer child, which offers an average reduction of emissions by 58.6 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, living car-free with an emissions reduction of 2.4 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, avoiding airplane travel with an emissions reduction of 1.6 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and eating a plant-based diet with an emissions reduction of 0.8 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And just in case the term tons of carbon dioxide equivalent is new to you, it is a metric measurement of different greenhouse gases like methane, water vapor, ozone, etc., based on their global warming potential, and then expressing them in terms in the amounts of other gases in terms of the equivalent of carbon dioxide with the same global warming potential. So expressing in terms of carbon dioxide equivalent just allows for simple comparisons to be made of activities, events, or industries that have different greenhouse gases associated with them that might otherwise be difficult to compare. So after I discovered this study, I decided that something easy and high impact that I could do right now and continue into the future was to give up eating meat. And making this decision is different for everyone, but for me, making this switch was an easy one. I grew up eating meat. My family ate a lot of chicken growing up. We didn't usually eat a lot of red meats. Those were kind of saved for special occasions, but even so, I found that it was pretty easy. I was pretty easily able to cut out meat from my diet, and it wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. And while my decision to switch to a plant-based diet was largely because of the environmental impact that decision had, there were also some other reasons that are different for everyone. For me, I had a lot of moral concerns about how animals are treated as livestock in the meat industry. Also, meat is expensive, and I discovered that I didn't really want to have to pay for it anymore. And then also I kind of figured out that I didn't really care for meat anymore. I always kind of thought it was meat sort of amplified a meal, but I found that I was enjoying my meals much more without meat, and my meals didn't need to have meat to be good or complete. Also, there's nothing worse than forgetting to take frozen meat out of the freezer to let it thaw for the rest of the day. So I didn't have to worry about that anymore, which was really nice. So I've been a vegetarian for almost 2 years now. And those are my thoughts and reasons for why I made the decision to switch to a plant-based diet and stop eating meat. Now, if you're considering doing the same or just thinking of eating less meat, these are the main points that I'm going to discuss with you for the next little bit that will hopefully help you make your decision. So these main points for cutting out meat and switching to a plant-based diet are because of the benefits for the environment, the benefits for you and your health, and the ability to have this one single individual choice make a bigger impact in the scale of things. So there are a few different ways that the food that we eat impacts the natural environment negatively. And one of them is the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we produce. The first point that I'm going to be talking about is the benefits for the environment of reducing meat consumption and eating more plant-based meals. I think a lot of people don't realize the impact that the food that we eat has on the environment and just how big that impact can be, especially when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. So when we consider the food that we eat and the greenhouse gas emissions that are produced from the food we eat, we have to consider food systems as a whole. And when I say food system, that means all the elements and activities that go into producing and consuming food. When we think of food, I'm sure a lot of us just think about the food getting from the grocery store and then eating it. But there are many different steps between the food being produced, the food being at the grocery store, and the food being on our plates. We have to consider all the steps. So we have to consider the way humans produce, process, prepare, transport, distribute, consume, and dispose of food. All these stages of the food system produce greenhouse gas emissions. And in total, food systems, so all of these stages, are responsible for 1/3 of all human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. But the majority of the greenhouse gas emissions related to food come from the agricultural processes of growing or producing the food. And what is the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are produced from the agricultural processes of our food systems? Well, in the year 2021, the agriculture sector was the 5th largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. You can see that they are in the light blue there, and they accounted for about 10% of the total national emissions, with 69 megatons of CO2 equivalent emitted. Globally, though, it's a lot higher, with food production being responsible for about 25% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. The greenhouse gas emissions from the agriculture sector can be attributed to 3 different areas, which are from on-the-farm fuel use, crop production, and animal production. Crop production releases greenhouse gases from things like the application of inorganic nitrogen fertilizers, the decomposition of crop residues, and the field burning of agricultural residues. Animal production releases greenhouse gases from things like housing the animals, storing manure, the deposited manure from raising animals, and the application of manure to manage soils. We can also see the amount of greenhouse gases emitted from these 3 different areas. So of the greenhouse gas emissions from the agriculture sector in 2021, about half of those emissions come from animal production. If we take a deeper look at the greenhouse gases that get emitted from the agriculture sector, and more specifically, animal production within the agriculture sector. So in total, livestock production is responsible for over 15% of all global greenhouse gas emissions per year. So all greenhouse gases that are being emitted around the world in 1 year, 15% of those come from animal production. On farms, animals like cows, goats, and sheep emit methane as they digest the grasses and plants that they eat. Methane also gets emitted from their manure and other waste. So 44% of all the greenhouse gas emissions from livestock are methane. Now, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, and it has a global warming potential that is about 25 times higher than the global warming potential of carbon dioxide. which means that methane is able to trap more heat from the sun than carbon dioxide. So even if methane is usually emitted in smaller quantities and lasts for shorter amounts of time in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide, smaller amounts of methane can still trap large amounts of heat and can contribute to climate change. So livestock production is emitting a lot of methane. And how much exactly? So nearly 1/3 of the world's human-caused methane emissions are caused by the livestock industry. So a really, really large amount. Overall, the livestock is producing a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, particularly a lot of methane emissions, which we know is contributing to human-caused climate change. This graph here shows the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted per kilogram of food product. And when we look at the greenhouse gas emissions that are produced from individual food products, we can see that at the top are all products from animals. We can also see how high the emissions are related to red meats and especially beef. And then towards the bottom, we see that plant-based meals, plant-based foods and crops emit significantly lower amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. So we explored how food systems as a whole emit greenhouse gases, but also how most of the emissions come from livestock and animal production. Animal-based foods emit significantly more greenhouse gases than plant-based foods. For example, beef emits 20 times more greenhouse gases per gram of edible protein than plant-based proteins. Research shows that just by switching to a plant-based diet, individuals can reduce anywhere from 300 to 1,600 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. Another way that our food systems have an impact on the environment and on the climate are by the abundance of important resources that are needed to produce the food that we eat, and the amount of those resources that end up wasted when it comes to intensive agriculture. So animal agriculture and livestock production use up substantial amounts of important resources like land, water, and energy resources. When we look at land and water resources specifically, we see that in total, farm-based food production occupies about 40% of the Earth's land. And of all the agricultural land in the world, so all of that 40%, 80% of that is used by the animal agriculture industry. Animal agriculture takes up a lot of land. So in saying that, decreasing global meat consumption and therefore global meat demand can decrease agriculture land use by 80%. When it comes to water, agriculture uses more freshwater resources than any other human activity. Agriculture is the #1 consumer of freshwater resources on Earth. And looking more closely at food production, agricultural food production uses 70% of the Earth's freshwater resources from rivers, reservoirs, and from groundwater. So in total, 1/3 of the freshwater on Earth is used up by the meat and dairy industries alone. Here we're comparing the resources that are required to make actual food products. So in terms of animal-based food products, per serving of beef requires almost 160 square meters of land and over 1,700 liters of water, or about 5 full bathtubs of water just for one serving of beef. We can see that beef uses up the most resources, but one serving of pork still requires 22 square meters of land and almost 700 liters of water. And chicken requires about the same amount of land as pork, but a little less water is required. When we look at plant-based foods, we can see that they use up significantly less land per serving, just 5 square meters for beans, 3 square meters for tofu, and only 0.1 square meters for growing common vegetable crops. Beans still use up a lot of water, but on average, plant-based foods also use significantly less water than foods that are produced from animals. There was one study that I found that said that reducing animal intake would reduce global water use by 14%. Here's some more comparisons for you between the resources that are required for animal-based food versus plant-based foods. So in 1.5 acres of land, you can produce 375 pounds of meat, or you can produce 37,000 pounds of plant-based food. To feed one person on a plant-based diet for 1 year, you would need about 18 times less land than to feed one person on an average meat-eating diet for 1 year. And in just one common beef burger, about 3,000 liters of water goes into it, which is about the same amount of water used from showering over a 2-month span. And just in that one beef burger uses up enough energy to power an iPhone for 6 whole months. So as you can see, eating less meat can preserve precious land and water resources and reduce the waste of those important resources. Another very damaging impact that our food systems can have on the environment is from the consequences that we see on biodiversity and habitats. A mostly meat-based diet has around a 3 times greater impact on biodiversity than a plant-based diet because of the high land use of animal agriculture, which results in a lot of land degradation, pollution, and contamination. Studies on the use of agricultural land also find that meat production is responsible for the death of at least 10 times as many animals as crops produce for human consumption. Now, one of the most devastating impacts that we're seeing because of climate change is a loss of biodiversity. With biodiversity loss, we're losing a lot of plants, we're losing a lot of animals, a lot of habitats, and entire ecosystems. But humans are also responsible for causing biodiversity loss. A report from the UN Convention to Combat Desertification that was released in 2022 found that human activities have already altered 70% of the Earth's land surface, degrading up to 40% of it. And one of the most significant ways that humans have altered and degraded land is through agriculture. One of the biggest threats to biodiversity is agricultural expansion, and that is primarily driven by livestock, either for grazing or producing crops to feed the livestock. And if you're unfamiliar with the term grazing, that is allowing the livestock to eat the wild vegetation. And for prime farmland, farmers want land with good soil and access to water, which can be hard to find in many parts of the world. Lands like this are usually found in forests and prairie wetlands, which support a variety of different ecosystems. So a lot of the time, these ecosystems are converted into farmland, which destroys all the habitats and biodiversity that previously lived there. With the global population growing every day, we need to be able to feed all the people that live on Earth, which I think is now over 8 billion people. So agriculture is expanding to be able to provide food for everyone. But because of this, agriculture is now expanding into more sensitive and important ecosystems, putting these areas at risk of destruction and the wildlife and biodiversity that live within them at risk of extinction. So the expansion of agriculture has caused massive losses in biodiversity around the world because natural habitats are being converted into farms and pastures for animal grazing. Industrial farms use pesticides and fertilizers that are polluting the environment, and those rich soils from forests and wetlands have been degraded. As a result of this, many plant and animal species will face extinction in future decades as land clearing, deforestation, and agricultural expansions increase. One of the most visible and alarming examples of this is the ongoing destruction of tropical rainforests, and specifically the Amazon rainforest in South America. Since the 1970s, the Amazon rainforest has lost about 18% of its forests. The rate of deforestation in the Amazon has more than doubled since 2019, and every year it keeps increasing. Every year, the Amazon loses an area of forest that is about the same size as the UK, which is especially alarming considering that the Amazon alone contains nearly 25% of all living land species on Earth and thousands of different animal and plant species. Tropical rainforests like the Amazon are mainly being deforested to accommodate the production of beef, soy, palm oil, and wood. But overall, providing land for beef cattle is responsible for more than double the deforestation of the production of soy, palm oil, and wood combined. In fact, much of the soy that is being produced in the Amazon is not even for humans, it is to feed the cattle. So altogether, 80% of deforestation in the Amazon has been attributed to providing land for beef cattle to graze. And why is this happening in the Amazon? Well, in the last few decades, industrial scaled agriculture has been dominating our food systems. So industrial agriculture has the goal of producing as much food as possible at the lowest possible cost. And this is done by increasing the use of chemical fertilizers, pesticides, energy, land, water, and waste. And it comes at the cost of permanently destroying precious forests, biodiversity, and affecting human health. Now, speaking of health, I personally believe that doing what is good for the environment is also good for human health. So if we're taking care of the environment, we're also in a way taking care of our health. And research shows that there are many benefits associated with eating less meat and incorporating more plant-based foods into our diets. Eating less meat and eating more plant-based foods has been shown to improve heart and kidney health. Plant-based eating has also been shown to reduce the risk of developing certain diseases like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and obesity. Eating less meat can reduce cholesterol, lower blood pressure, and improve overall gut health. People who eat more plant-based meals usually consume fewer calories overall in a day, and particularly calories from fats. Plant-based meals usually contain more fiber, potassium, and vitamin C than meals from animal products. And consuming processed meats and red meats in particular, so beef, pork, lamb, may increase the risk of developing certain cancers such as pancreatic, colon, stomach, and prostate cancer. Some of the skepticism about plant-based diets that I often hear is that they don't provide a lot of protein or as much protein as meat, but that's not the case. Both plants and animals provide quality protein for human consumption. There are differences in the protein from animals versus the protein from plants. For example, there are differences in the combinations of vitamins, minerals, and types of fat. But overall, plant-based foods are able to provide the same recommended dietary allowance of protein as meals containing meat. Plant-based foods like nuts, beans, and grains like lentils, chickpeas, and edamame are foods that are high in protein, and I think they're pretty delicious. Going back to what is good for the environment is good for human health. In our current food systems, and with the meat industry in particular, in agriculture, we're seeing a lot of factory farms. Factory farms are an industrial method of farming and raising farmed animals. Often the animals are put under horrible and unethical conditions, but I'm not going to go too much into that topic, but there are many documentaries and resources out there on the internet that go more into this if you want to learn more. Overall, though, factory farms are not good for overall public health. Factory farming releases pollutants like ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, methane, and sometimes particulate matter that affect air quality into the atmosphere, and those have an impact on public health. Breathing in these pollutants can cause health issues such as asthma, chronic bronchitis, and pneumonia. So to kind of go into the last bit of my presentation, I wanted to talk about how reducing meat consumption and eating more plant-based foods can actually make an impact. I talked about at the beginning how switching to a plant-based diet is one of the most effective actions that individuals can take to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but really, how effective is it? How does one person not eating meat or eating meat one less time a week, how does that actually make a difference? And is not eating meat the be-all, end-all to climate action and reducing emissions? Well, no, absolutely not, but it can be a start. So how can one person, or can one person going meatless actually make a difference? My answer is yes. Even if you think you're just one person, just like with anything, the more people that do it, the bigger the difference it can make. So the more people that begin to adopt meatless meals throughout the week, the easier it will be to reduce meat from our diets and the more normalized it will become. With more people eating less meat, there is less demand for meat production, and with less meat production comes reduced emissions and reduced land degradation. Eating more plant-based foods and eating less meat is a great example of how small individual actions contribute to larger collective actions. And it's important for all of us to understand that entire sectors of the economy, like food production and the meat and dairy industries, can be shifted by consumers' dietary change. Individuals can make a difference even by just reducing their meat consumption to 2 servings per week. Another interesting thing that came from the study that I mentioned at the beginning was that the willingness of individuals to eat less meat increases with the perceived effectiveness of the action. So people are willing to eat less meat when they fully understand the implications of that action. And what kind of benefits does plant-based eating have on reducing the impact on the environment? Well, plant-based eating can cut your carbon footprint by a whole 50%. Even just going meatless once a week reduces the same amount of emissions as not driving in a car for a whole month. And if you skip beef just once a week for 1 year, that saves the equivalent amount of emissions from driving over 500 kilometers in a car. So, what can you do to lower the greenhouse gas emissions associated with our food systems? There are many things that you can do that don't include just eating less meat. Yes, you can participate in Meatless Mondays or try to go meatless for more days in the week or try to cut down on meat consumption in general, but you can also reduce your food waste. As Canadians, we waste a ton of food, food that, as we know, took a lot of resources, lots of land, lots of water to make. So we need to make sure that all those precious resources don't go to waste and just end up in our kitchen garbage cans. If you do have food scraps, make sure you compost them and if your community has a composting program. If your community doesn't, composting is something you can start up in your backyard. It can be a fun and easy project to do with your family. Other things you can do to lower your emissions are to shop for food that is produced locally, shop for food that is produced without the use of pesticides, and eat food that is in season. And if you don't want to give up meat entirely, that is okay, but there are ways to sustainably source your meat. I work with someone who was a vegetarian for years and years, and just recently she started eating meat again. But the meat that she eats, she makes sure is from local sources or from farms that have sustainable and ethical practices. So in general, a lot of this comes down to doing your own research and doing what works best for you. You might make your food choices based on their environmental impact, but you should also consider other factors like health needs, preferences, where you live, what your budget is, etc. I also think it's important to note that I'm not saying that everyone has to switch to a meatless diet tomorrow. Is the meat industry a huge emitter of greenhouse gases and a large source of biodiversity and habitat loss? Yes, absolutely. And is eating less meat a significant way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Yes, again, absolutely. However, all together, we should all be more conscious of how the food that we eat gets to our plates, where it comes from, and what had to be destroyed or displaced for it to be produced. We need to realize that with our current agricultural practices, certain foods have a larger impact on the environment than others, and that right now the meat industry has the largest impact of all. So to make a difference, we can eat less meat, like I do, but we can also push for more sustainable agricultural practices. However, in order for more sustainable and nature-friendly farming, there needs to be some dietary changes in society to decrease the pressure of converting natural and biodiverse land into agriculture. And this dietary change of eating less meat needs to come from people in higher income countries. Once we have that societal dietary change, we need to transform our agricultural practices into more sustainable and regenerative farming, where we're building up natural resources to create healthy soils and clean water instead of using them up and destroying them. And these regenerative agricultural practices are nothing new. These practices have been used by Indigenous peoples worldwide for thousands of years. Indigenous peoples would still eat meat. They would still and still do hunt and fish for food, but they do it in a way that is in balance with nature. They never took more than they needed. They never destroy habitats, and they are never wasteful. So reviving these Indigenous traditions and preserving them will make agriculture around the world more sustainable. This shift to more regenerative agriculture is going to be so crucial in the coming years, especially as climate change worsens and the impacts become more severe. Globally, climate change is a threat to food security, and the impacts of climate change are going to affect the quality and quantity of food that's being produced, and unfortunately, the ability to distribute that food equally. This is going to cause food prices to rise and is going to affect consumers. So with a growing population, food demand is going to rise, but there are going to be constraints on the availability of resources like land and water to meet those growing food demands. Resources that are also going to be affected by climate change. So agricultural land that is going to be affected by climate change, and some land in parts of the world that were previously used for agriculture in the past that can't support crops anymore because of climate change. So there are many things that are going to affect our food systems in the future, things that are already starting to happen and that we're already starting to see. And plant-based eating has the ability to alleviate some of the strain that climate change currently has on our food systems. But in the long term, what we really need is more sustainable agricultural practices that don't put resources, biodiversity, and the earth as a whole at risk. Some of these more sustainable agricultural practices include agroecology and agroforestry. Agroecology is the practice of harnessing biodiversity in agriculture to build sustainable, diverse agricultural ecosystems. In agriculture today, we mostly see monocultures, so only growing one crop in an area instead of a variety. And this is done usually because one crop can produce a high yield and a productive crop. So again, producing as much food as possible for the lowest possible cost. And agroecology, you add more variety to monocultured fields, which has benefits to the crop and to biodiversity. Again, this practice of agriculture is very common in Indigenous cultures. Indigenous peoples select plants to grow together that they know are going to benefit each other and help each other grow. In some Indigenous communities, this is known as the Three Sisters teaching, where corn, beans, and squash are grown together in intercrop systems, and all three are able to grow more effectively together than if they were separated. In agroforestry, woody plants are included in crops and pastures to break up monocultures, and trees are also a great source to have in farms since tree roots enhance soil fertility and prevent soil erosion, and trees are able to absorb and store carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So in most cases, agroforestry sees a 40% increase in crop yields compared to monocultures. It's also possible to include livestock on agroecological farms. Livestock can still be beneficial for agriculture with careful grazing on grasslands, which can benefit biodiversity on wild grasslands and on the farm. And lastly, I wanted to leave you with some of my favorite plant-based foods. So as you saw for my last bit of my presentation, plant-based eating is good for the environment, good for your health, and good for the planet as a whole. But the food is also really tasty, and you can get really creative with what you cook. So try out some of these if you haven't already. And yeah, some of my favorites are breaded cauliflower bites, butternut squash ravioli, zucchini parmesan, and vegetarian chili with chickpeas and black beans. So I really encourage you to give it a try if your lifestyle is able to accommodate. And like I said, there's a lot of benefits to it. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Emma, and please put your questions in the chat, or if you choose, you could raise your hand. So I'll go to the chat to begin with, and Abby has mentioned that Clean North has a gardening guide for schools and daycare facilities. And on the chat, she's given the link that Clean North has to get that. Sherry said, we found that buying meat at grocery stores also comes with a lot of styrofoam and packaging waste. So would you like to comment on that, Emma?
Yeah, so when I was talking about food systems earlier and the different elements that go into food systems, one of them is like the packaging and the transportation of the food that we come in. And yeah, you're right. A lot of the packaging that we get from grocery stores is plastic. Plastic is able to kind of enhance the longevity of the food, but plastic is not great for the environment, as we know. It takes a while to decompose, and if not recycled properly, it can end up in the natural environment and oceans. So yeah, another way that you can reduce your emissions related to food systems is to really be careful of the packaging that your food comes in. Are you buying food that comes with a lot of plastic or styrofoam packaging? Again, if you go to like local farmers markets or local grocery shops, they're usually much better with packaging than going to these big chain stores. But that's definitely another way that you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions related to your food systems.
Okay, David said, I believe that knowing and supporting farmers that use regenerative practices with their livestock and crop operations, no-till, rotation, grazing, also has an impact on making, also has an impact on climate change. Would you like to maybe elaborate on some of your previous comments in that way?
Definitely, yeah. So regenerative agriculture is something that as a society we need to push for the future, to kind of replace the industrial and intensive agriculture that we've seen over the past couple of decades. So supporting any regenerative farms that are already in existence is a huge way to support that cause. There are many out there in Canada and in around the world that are already doing this great work. So we really need to elevate what they're doing. I think it's the future of farming and the future of agriculture, and a lot of farmers are aware of this and they're moving towards this. They're realizing that it has a lot of positive impacts and benefits for their farm, for the animals on the farm, for the crops that they're producing, and then for the biodiversity surrounding their farm as well. So definitely, yes, elevating the regenerative agricultural practices that are already existing is definitely a first step.
Okay, Ted McPherson has his hand raised. So Ted, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I had a question, perhaps. We realize that climate change, there's no one solution. There are many different solutions. And particularly, I have a problem with the slide the first slide that you showed, I think, that showed, by far the most important thing we can do is don't have any children.
Yeah.
And yes, it's true that if everybody in the world didn't have any children, the climate change problem would disappear. But I don't think that's a good solution. You don't want to look at that in isolation from other things. What we should be doing is cutting our emissions. In Canada, we're already in pretty good shape that way. We're having fewer children, and we're not keeping up with the population. Like a mother has less than 2 children. So we're already pretty good on that. And that's not the way we need to make changes. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's different for everyone. And I know that in Canada, we may not be having as many children as before. And I'm all for that. Globally, though, it's not the same globally, and the population is growing every day in different parts of the world, and I think it's just different for everyone. So we saw that having one fewer child can really have an impact on the amount of greenhouse gases that are produced, but not everyone is going to be able to do that, and that's okay. I think it all depends on what you're able to do in your life and where you're able to make the biggest difference. And if you choose to not have a child because of your belief that maybe you're helping the environment or other reasons, that's great. If you choose to not have a car in your life and rather use public transportation or active transportation, and that makes the most sense for your life, and that's how you're able to cut greenhouse gas emissions, I also think that's great. So I think it depends on the person and what you're able to contribute in your individual life with your individual lifestyle. For me, again, it was cutting out meat. I know other people maybe aren't able to do that or don't want to do that. And then that's okay. It's about finding the action that you can do every day that is going to make an impact. So yeah, I appreciate your comment, Ted.
Okay.
Okay. Back to the chat then. Abby asks, can you repeat the 3 statistics you gave on how individual cutting meat reduces their greenhouse gas emissions?
I can see if I can find that one. If I think I know which one you're referring to. Was it so plant-based eating can cut your carbon footprint by 50%. Going meatless once a week reduces the same amount of emissions as not driving a car for 1 whole month. And then if you skip beef once a week for 1 year, that saves the equivalent amount of emissions from driving over 500 kilometers in a car. Was that what you were referring to, Abby?
Yes, Abby, you have yourself muted, so not sure if you're there, but you'd have to unmute.
Abby responded that yes, in the chat, that's what she was referring to.
Okay.
So yeah.
All right, good. Kara then asks, are plant-based meat alternatives like Impossible Meat environmentally friendly or friendlier?
Overall, they're friendlier than completely meat-based or animal-based food products. I wouldn't say they're friendlier or environmentally friendly compared to actual plant-based foods. There can be a lot of chemicals that go into these meat alternatives. Personally, I don't eat a lot of meat alternatives. I don't really like the taste of them. I find I just don't really like them. So for some people they work, and they are, again, friendlier than maybe like a strictly meat-based diet or beef. But I wouldn't say they're necessarily a solution either.
Okay, Carmen says, thank you for such a thorough and well-researched presentation, Emma. Seeing the link between agriculture and climate change opens me to how my actions and how I eat can impact climate change in a meaningful way.
Yeah, thank you for your comment, Carmen. That was the whole point of my presentation. Just for me, I was able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by going meatless. But even if we can all just realize that the food we eat has an impact on the environment, and if we can kind of think about that when we're buying food, when we're eating food, I think that is a great step.
Okay, Stefan says, you claim we can cut out 15% of our emissions, but by cutting out our meat consumption. Is this based on a global statistic?
So 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions are from the agriculture industry and from specifically animal production. The EPA says that 3.9% of American green emissions come from livestock, given the low impact this has.
Sorry, yeah.
Oh.
The EPA says
No
that
worries.
3.9% of American greenhouse gas emissions come from livestock. Presumably, that's similar to in Canada. And then he says, given the relatively low impact this has for us privileged Westerners, what really is the point?
So kind of going back to the slides I had towards the end, that if we all kind of do this, it has a much bigger impact than just one single person doing it. If all of us were to reduce meat consumption in our lives, we're reducing the demand for meat. We're reducing the production of meat, which is having a lesser impact on the environment. But again, I don't want it necessarily to be that meat is the problem. It's just the way that we're currently producing meat that is the problem, and that is responsible for a lot of greenhouse gases. So I know probably we can't fully give up eating meat, but we can change the way that we're producing it, the way that we're farming it, because it's currently it's unsustainable. It's producing a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So the first step is that dietary change in Western cultures, in low or higher income countries. And once we kind of achieve that and reduce the demand and the production, we can push for those larger agricultural changes.
Okay. Abby said, I use ChatGPT to devise vegetarian versions of meals. Recently, ChatGPT gave me beautiful recipes for vegetarian Moroccan risotto. I just wanted to marry Moroccan and Italian. I think she's talking about food there. And veggie burgers that won't fall apart while cooking.
Awesome. Yeah, that's there's so many great recipes out there that you can find for plant-based and vegetarian options. And like I said, you don't need meat really to enhance your meal, even if you can just go meatless for once one day in a week. There's some really great recipes out there, and I'd be happy to share some as well if you'd like. But that's awesome, Abby. I'll have to try that recipe.
Okay, and Kara said, I know people who are pescatarians who think it's better. Has any study shown this, given the over harvesting of the oceans?
Yeah, so there's a lot again of unsustainable practices that come into fish harvesting, and so I personally don't know a lot of I look into a lot of kind of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the meat industry, specifically with beef. And I know it's kind of the same for fishing. There's a lot of things that need to be fixed in those industries and cleaned up, and it can be unsustainable, it can be unethical in certain parts of the world. I'd have to look more into whether a certain study has shown that it's better or worse, or has the same amount of impact. So that's a really great question.
Okay. Does anybody else have a question? You could put up your hand, or you could put something in the chat.
I totally agree with you, Ted. Yes, so Ted is saying that in Canada, 10% of emissions come from agriculture and over 50% from oil and gas and transportation. So certainly plant-based eating can help. But in Canada, we have an elephant in the room, and we also need to reduce the big emissions. So I totally agree with you, Ted. Again, I'm a strong believer that individual actions can add up, but at the same time, we need to push for corporations to make changes, especially big oil and gas. We need to push for our government to make changes. So yeah, individual actions can help, such as going plant-based eating, or maybe giving up your car. But we also need to push collectively for those bigger changes. We need to stop burning fossil fuels, which are contributing the most greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And then definitely in Canada, we're still a really big producer of oil and gas. So that is something that we need to fix and something we need to push for. So totally agree, Ted.
Okay, and then Kara says maybe maybe SCC starts every webinar with 100 companies who are responsible for 70% of greenhouse gases. That's SCC is the Sioux Climate Hub, by the way. So I guess that's on us, not on you, Emma, but if you can help, that'd be great. And then Stefan says 100% of the carbon in cow burps is from CO2 that a plant absorbed. Is this cycle considered in calculating greenhouse gas emissions from beef production?
So when it comes to cow burps, it's actually methane that they're emitting into the atmosphere. Is this cycle considered in calculating greenhouse gas emissions? from beef production. I would say yes, it is. It's a very minimal kind of amount in the scheme of things. But I do think they are considered overall, yes.
Okay, and well, I'll just go back to Kara. I missed her final point. She says, I'm going to watch the new vegan show. Thanks for all the info. And then she says, thanks so much, Emma. And thank you, Emma. That's been an excellent presentation. Again, for those of you who would like to see it again, we do have the videos of the webinars on our Facebook page. As a reminder, our next webinar will be on Wednesday, May the 31st at 7:30. And Peter Tanazzo, the Director of Planning for Community Development and Enterprises Services, the City of Sault Ste. Marie, will talk about the city's active transportation plan. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Sault Climate Hub. It was great.
Thanks, Emma. I just wanted to mention that the people who are left, it will be on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days.